For decades, professional football sold the same idea to every young player walking through the door. You need the league more than it needs you. The system was the prize. The shield was the power. If you wanted access to fame, money, and relevance, you accepted the structure as is and hoped the rewards came later. That assumption held up for generations. But now, quietly and without warning, that balance just cracked. Because Shedeur Sanders didn't step into the NFL as someone asking for permission. He showed up with leverage already in hand. What's got executives uneasy isn't a stat line or a depth chart move. It's a contract detail most fans weren't supposed to notice at all. No flashy press release, no viral graphic, just language buried in paperwork that suggests this wasn't a traditional rookie agreement. According to reports circulating in league circles, Sanders didn't sign on as a long-term project or a hopeful investment. He entered as something far more disruptive. A self-contained commercial ecosystem that doesn't rely on snaps, starts, or even wins to generate value. The league has always been comfortable controlling the funnel. You play, they promote. You perform, they monetize. Your name, your face, your highlights all get processed through an ecosystem designed to benefit the institution first. That's how it's always worked. But this time, the flow appears reversed. Sanders arrived with his own audience, his own distribution, and a fan base that had already been converting attention into real money long before draft night. That alone bends the usual power dynamic. The whispers say the contract reflects that shift in a way the NFL hasn't fully dealt with yet. And this didn't happen in isolation. Anyone paying attention knows the mindset didn't come out of nowhere. Deion Sanders has spent years publicly calling out leagues and institutions for profiting off athletes while preaching patience and loyalty. This moment feels less like rebellion and more like execution. Not loud, not emotional, just precise. If reports are accurate, the deal wasn't designed to fight the system head-on. It simply exists outside the parts of the system that matter most. What makes this unsettling for league executives is that nothing about it appears reckless. There's no rule-breaking headline to point to, no obvious violation to shut down. The structure fans are now dissecting seems rooted in basic contract principles most players never think to challenge. That's the part that sticks. If one rookie can walk in with full control over his brand and revenue streams tied directly to his identity, it raises an uncomfortable question. How many players before him gave that up without realizing they didn't have to? The team at the center of all this didn't push back either. If anything, they leaned in. Reports suggest the Cleveland Browns viewed Sanders less as a risky quarterback pick and more as a market-aware partner. That framing alone says everything about how different this situation is. This wasn't about arm strength projections or developmental timelines. It was about audience stability, built-in engagement, and revenue that doesn't disappear if a player sits on the bench. And that's why this moment matters far beyond one contract. If even part of what's being discussed holds up, it forces the NFL to confront a reality it's been avoiding. Value no longer begins and ends on the field. Influence, attention, and ownership now travel with the player, and when that player doesn't need the league to manufacture relevance, the leverage quietly flips. The scary part for the system isn't that Sanders asked for too much, it's that he may have simply asked the right way. And once you see that shift, it's impossible to unsee it. Because if this contract is real in the way insiders suggest, it isn't just a win for one quarterback, it's a signal that the next generation isn't showing up empty-handed anymore. And what comes next could force the league to rewrite assumptions it's relied on for decades. At first glance, nothing about this looked unusual. A young quarterback enters the league. A team signs him. Another rookie deal joins the pile. That's how it's supposed to go. But the reason this deal feels different is because the value conversation didn't start with football. It started with leverage, and not the kind you earn after Pro Bowls or playoff runs, the kind you arrive with already built. Shedeur Sanders didn't walk into negotiations hoping the league would make him valuable. He walked in proving he already was. Traditionally, rookie contracts are about projection. Teams pay for what they hope a player becomes. That's why salaries are capped, timelines are rigid, and control lives almost entirely on the organizational side. The player supplies labor, the league supplies exposure. But this time, that equation didn't cleanly apply. Sanders wasn't selling potential attention, he brought attention with him, a following that didn't need primetime games to activate, a fan base that was already buying, watching, sharing, and engaging regardless of uniform. That's the subtle shift most people miss. When a player can generate interest independent of the league stops being the sole gatekeeper. And according to ongoing reports and industry chatter, that independence was acknowledged in the contract itself, not as a favor, as a fact. The deal didn't treat fame as something to be unlocked later. It treated it as an existing asset that needed to be protected from day one. This also explains why so many fans felt something was off before they knew what it was. The reaction online didn't look like a typical rookie buzz cycle. Jerseys moved fast. Clips traveled instantly. Conversations happened whether the team promoted them or not. That's usually what you see with established stars, not first-year players. The difference here is that Sanders didn't need the league to introduce him. The audience already knew exactly who he was and where to find him. And when a player shows up like that, the team's role changes. Instead of manufacturing visibility, the organization becomes a conduit, a distribution partner instead of a spotlight holder. That's a dangerous reframe for any league built on centralized control, because once one deal acknowledges that reality, others start asking why theirs didn't. If this model works even partially, it exposes how outdated the old assumptions really are. The reason this deal feels heavier than a normal signing isn't because of one clause or one number. It's because it challenges the unspoken rule that players must earn autonomy after years of compliance. Sanders arrived without accepting that bargain, and if that sounds small, it isn't. It's the kind of shift that doesn't make noise at first, but quietly forces everyone in the room to reevaluate where the power actually sits. And that brings up the next question no one can ignore. If this wasn't an accident, then it had to be built somewhere, and the foundation wasn't poured in the NFL at all. Long before league offices ever reviewed paperwork or front offices debated depth charts, the infrastructure was already in place. That's the part that makes this so hard to dismiss. Shedeur Sanders didn't begin building his presence once cameras followed him into a locker room. Reports suggest the foundation was laid years earlier, during a period when most prospects are told to keep their heads down and wait their turn. Instead of waiting, he was building something the league normally controls. During his college years, Sanders wasn't just playing football. He was learning how attention moves, how fans engage, and how digital platforms convert interest into loyalty. His online presence didn't feel outsourced or polished by a corporate machine. It felt direct, consistent, personal. That matters. Because audiences can tell when they're being marketed to versus when they're being included. And by the time the NFL became a real possibility, that audience wasn't theoretical. It was active, measurable, and already responding with real spending behavior. This is where the NIL era quietly changed everything. For the first time, elite prospects were allowed to understand their own value before a league ever defined it for them. Sanders didn't just participate in that environment. According to people familiar with his approach, he treated it like a testing ground. Merch drops, branded content, direct fan engagement, not for flex, but for data. What converts, what travels, what lasts. By the time draft conversations started, there was proof attached to the hype. That proof is what separates this from past stars who were simply popular. Popularity fades, infrastructure doesn't. Sanders entered the league not needing to figure out monetization later because it was already operating. The brand wasn't waiting on NFL exposure to turn on. It was on already. The jersey just changed the backdrop. Behind the scenes, this kind of preparation doesn't happen by accident. It requires intention, planning, and an understanding that football careers are short, but ownership can last much longer. Industry chatter suggests this is where the influence of Deion Sanders becomes impossible to ignore. Deion has spoken for years about athletes failing to protect what they built. This moment looks like the practical application of that mindset. Not a speech, not a protest, just structure. And when that structure meets league negotiations, everything shifts. Teams usually dictate terms because players need access. Sanders didn't. He had visibility without them, revenue without them, distribution that didn't rely on broadcast slots or league-owned channels. That doesn't mean the league lost relevance, it means it lost exclusivity. And exclusivity has always been the real source of power. This is why the deal couldn't be treated like business as usual. You can't tell someone to wait for opportunity when they've already created their own. You can't dangle exposure when the exposure is baked in. By the time Sanders arrived at the doorstep of the NFL, the leverage wasn't speculative, it was functioning. Which leads to the most uncomfortable realization of all. If one player could do this before ever taking a professional snap, it means others could have too. They just didn't know they were allowed to build first. To understand how this mindset took shape, you have to step away from contracts and look at history. Deion Sanders didn't spend his playing career quietly accepting how the system worked. From the moment he entered professional sports, he challenged the idea that athletes should be grateful passengers instead of owners of their own value. He understood early that leagues didn't just profit from performance, they profited from identity, and they did it at scale. Deion lived both sides of that reality. He saw how his name drove ticket sales, how his personality boosted ratings, how highlights built entire marketing campaigns. Yet control over those moments rarely lived with the player, it lived with the institution. That disconnect became one of his most consistent talking points long after retirement. He wasn't subtle about it. He warned athletes publicly that the checks stop, but the footage keeps making money, and most players never see a cent of it. That perspective didn't disappear when he became a coach. If anything, it sharpened. During his time developing players, Deion consistently pushed the idea that talent alone wasn't enough. You had to understand business, branding, and leverage, or someone else would do it for you.
Message wasn't about chasing fame, it was about defending ownership. In that context, what we're seeing now doesn't feel accidental, it feels intentional. Reports suggest Shedeur didn't just grow up around football, he grew up around negotiations, media, and contracts. He saw firsthand how value is extracted and who usually benefits. So when it came time to prepare for the league, the objective wasn't just to be draft ready, it was to be system ready. To walk in knowing which rights mattered and which concessions were irreversible once signed away. That's what separates influence from involvement. Deion didn't need to sit at the negotiating table to shape this outcome. The philosophy was already embedded. Build before you arrive, own before you license, protect before you perform. That way, the conversation shifts from permission to partnership. And that shift is exactly what makes this situation uncomfortable for league executives. This influence also explains the calm confidence surrounding the deal. There was no public posturing, no dramatic rollout, no pressure campaign through the media. When you know the leverage is real, you don't need to be loud. You let the structure speak for itself. And by the time the contract surfaced, the pieces were already locked in. What's unsettling for the league is that this approach isn't limited to one family. It's teachable. It can be replicated. And once players realize that someone like Shedeur didn't force the system to bend, he simply refused to walk in unprotected, the conversation changes. Because now the question isn't whether Deion influenced this move, it's how many players wish they'd been taught this sooner. For weeks now, the conversation around this deal hasn't been happening on press conferences or official team channels. It's been happening in quiet corners of the internet, inside agent group chats, and among fans who noticed something didn't add up. They keep circling the same idea, the clause, not in name, not in confirmed language, but in effect. According to ongoing rumors and reports, there's a piece of this agreement that operates outside what most people think a rookie contract can do. What's being whispered about isn't a loophole or a trick,
It's something far more unsettling for the league. The belief is that Shedeur Sanders retained full control over his name, image, and likeness in ways that most NFL contracts quietly absorb into league systems. No carve-outs, no shared licensing pool, just ownership that stays with the player unless explicitly given away. To be clear, none of this has been officially confirmed, line by line, but the consistency of what's being reported is what's turning heads. Here's why this matters. For decades, leagues didn't need to take control of identity. Players signed it over automatically. It was normalized, buried in standard language, rarely questioned. If this clause exists in the way insiders suggest, it didn't rewrite the rules, it simply refused to accept defaults. And that distinction makes it powerful, because if ownership isn't surrendered, it remains personal. That's contract law at its most basic level. The second part of the whisper is what really makes executives uncomfortable. Reports claim the structure allows revenue tied directly to Sanders' identity to bypass traditional league funnels. Merch, content, appearances, digital engagement. Instead of being filtered through centralized licensing systems, the value flows on a parallel track. Again, this isn't being presented publicly as fact, but the numbers fans are watching don't feel hypothetical. They feel active, and that disconnect is what's fueling speculation.
If true, this wouldn't just be about money, it would be about precedent, because the league's entire media empire is built on aggregated player identities, highlights, jerseys, clips, campaigns. When one player opts out of that flow without breaking a rule, it doesn't expose a vulnerability, it exposes an assumption, the assumption that no one would ever ask. What makes this clause so dangerous to the status quo isn't aggression, it's simplicity. There's nothing radical about retaining what you never agreed to give away. Yet that idea shakes a system that depends on silent compliance. That's why people inside the business aren't dismissing this as hype. They're studying it. Because if the structure holds, it can be reused, dropped into other contracts, adapted across sports, scaled without needing permission. And that's the quiet fear behind the whispers. Not that one player got a better deal, but that the deal might be clean, legal, ordinary. Which means the only reason it hasn't happened before is because athletes didn't know they could demand it. And once that realization spreads, the conversation stops being about Shedeur Sanders and starts being about everyone who signs next. At first, it sounds backwards. Why would any team agree to a structure that limits control and hands leverage to a rookie? For decades, the safest move was to keep contracts tight, standardized, and team-friendly. But here's the part most fans miss. From a business perspective, saying yes might actually be the smarter play, especially when the player arrives already monetized. Teams usually gamble millions on projection. Will this quarterback develop? Will fans care? Will jerseys sell if he struggles early? That's the risk baked into almost every rookie deal. But with Shedeur Sanders, reports suggest much of that uncertainty was already solved. The demand existed before the first snap. The audience was already tuned in. That flips the risk profile entirely. When attention and engagement are preloaded, the team isn't betting on potential, it's onboarding an operating business. That's where the logic clicks. A player with an active, loyal following generates revenue whether he's starting or sitting. Engagement doesn't disappear after a bad game. Content still moves, merch still sells, attention still compounds. For a franchise, that's stability, and stability is rare in a league where performance can swing value overnight. In that sense, a brand-forward player isn't a liability, he's a hedge. This is why reports suggest the Cleveland Browns didn't treat the deal like a concession, they treated it like a partnership. Instead of asking, what if he fails on the field, the question becomes, what if his platform succeeds regardless? When you look at it that way, the upside isn't capped by stats alone. The team benefits from relevance, reach, and exposure that no marketing department can manufacture from scratch. There's also a quieter advantage teams are starting to recognize. A player who owns his brand doesn't need the organization to overextend itself promoting him. That lowers internal costs. It reduces pressure to force narratives. The audience finds the content organically.
The team simply rides the wave. In a league obsessed with controlling messaging, that's an unusual but powerful position to be in. And then there's the locker room effect. When players see a franchise willing to adapt instead of clamp down, it sends a signal. This is a place open to modern leverage, a place that understands how the world outside the stadium works now. That matters to the next generation of talent, especially those growing up fluent in platforms, metrics, and monetization.
So when people ask why a team would ever agree to this kind of clause, the answer is simple. Because the old model assumed players needed teams to be valuable. The new reality is that some players arrive valuable already. And when that happens, the smartest move isn't to fight it, it's to align with it. For most of NFL history, scouting was a closed system. Size, speed, arm strength, film breakdowns, everything about a player's value lived between the numbers. The assumption was simple. If you control the field, everything else follows. But that framework is starting to feel incomplete. Not wrong, just outdated. Because now teams are being forced to evaluate something they never had to quantify before: influence. With players like Shedeur Sanders, the evaluation doesn't stop at game tape. It extends into audience behavior. How fast does attention grow? How loyal is the fan base? Do people show up consistently or only when the hype peaks? These aren't vanity questions anymore. They're revenue indicators. And according to growing industry chatter, front offices are quietly building new internal models to track them. This doesn't mean talent suddenly matters less. It means the value stack has expanded. A quarterback with elite mechanics but no resonance brings one type of upside. A quarterback with strong fundamentals and a self-sustaining platform brings another. When a player can activate fans without league mediation, his floor rises, even if his ceiling on the field is still being debated. What's changed is that influence is now measurable. Engagement rates, conversion data, merchandise velocity, content reach. This information used to be ignored or dismissed as noise. Now it's being studied because it answers a question teams care deeply about: how much value exists independent of wins and losses. When that number is significant, the player stops being just a roster spot. He becomes an asset that behaves more like a media property. That shift forces scouts and executives to speak a new language. Instead of only asking how a player fits the scheme, they're starting to ask how he fits the market. Can he move attention? Can he stabilize interest during a rebuild? Can he keep the franchise culturally relevant even when the record slips? These questions would have sounded ridiculous 10 years ago. Now they're unavoidable. There's also a competitive angle no one wants to say out loud. If one team factors this in and another doesn't, the difference shows up fast. Fans follow players more than logos now. If your franchise doesn't know how to work with that reality, you lose ground. Not just on Sundays, but online, where relevance compounds daily. This is where the evaluation game changes permanently. Prospects aren't just being measured against each other on the field, they're being compared as ecosystems. Some arrive empty, others arrive operational. And once teams see that contrast, they can't pretend they didn't. Because choosing not to value influence doesn't make it disappear. It just means someone else will leverage it better. And that's exactly why this conversation doesn't stop with rookies. Because when evaluation criteria evolve, contracts follow. And when contracts follow, the people who signed old deals start asking uncomfortable questions about what they were never evaluated for at all. The loudest reaction to all of this didn't come from owners or executives. It came from veterans who suddenly realized what this moment implies about their past. Because once you understand how this deal may be structured, you can't help but look backward and do the math. Not just on money, but on control. And that's where the discomfort starts. For years, most players never questioned what happened to their identity once they signed. Highlights aired everywhere, jerseys sold globally, clips lived forever on league channels. It all felt normal. That was the bargain. You played, the machine distributed, and you were thankful for the exposure.
But now, watching Shedeur Sanders reportedly retain ownership others assumed was impossible, veterans are revisiting contracts they barely skimmed at the time. And what they're seeing isn't small. It's not just percentages, it's rights that were quietly absorbed into centralized systems, rights to footage, rights to licensing, rights to monetize moments that defined entire careers. Many are realizing they didn't just sign deals, they signed away autonomy without ever being told they had a choice, and that realization hits harder than any missed paycheck ever could. What makes this sting isn't jealousy, it's clarity. Veterans aren't angry that a rookie may have secured better terms, they're frustrated that the opportunity was always there, hidden behind language no one encouraged them to question. For players who built the league's modern popularity, that realization feels like betrayal by normalization. This is how it's done. Don't overthink it. Sign and go play. That mindset is starting to collapse. There's also fear layered beneath the frustration. If the league starts accepting players who arrive with retained rights, what happens to the ones who already gave theirs up? Does the value of their likeness stay locked away forever? Are they stuck watching highlights from their prime generate revenue they'll never see? These aren't hypothetical concerns, they're legacy questions, and legacy matters when the career is short and the footage is forever. The locker room impact is real. Younger players are watching closely, veterans are warning them quietly. Conversations that used to be about contracts and guarantees are now about ownership and exit control. That's a cultural shift the league didn't plan for. And once those conversations start happening peer-to-peer, they spread fast. This is why the anxiety feels so different. It's not about one clause, it's about exposure. Seeing that the system didn't change, the awareness did. And awareness can't be rolled back. Because once players understand that what they signed away wasn't inevitable, the silence disappears. And when silence disappears, so does compliance. What's happening here doesn't stop at one locker room or even one league. That's the part making executives nervous in places far removed from football offices. Because once a model proves viable in one major sport, it stops being a curiosity and starts becoming a template. And right now, people across the sports world are watching this unfold as a potential turning point, not an anomaly. Inside the NFL, the immediate concern is containment. If one player can retain control and operate independently without violating league rules, others will ask why they can't. But beyond football, that question gets even louder. Front offices in the NBA, global soccer organizations, combat sports promotions, and Olympic committees are all dealing with the same underlying tension. Stars are arriving with audiences already attached. The old idea that leagues create fame no longer holds the way it once did. In basketball, this shift is already visible. Players build global followings before draft night. In combat sports, individual brands often outweigh the promotions themselves. What's new is the realization that contract structure doesn't have to lag behind that reality. If a player can walk in with leverage intact and keep it, the power balance tilts everywhere at once. One league adapting doesn't solve the problem. It pressures every other league to choose a side. This is where the domino effect takes shape. If one organization embraces player ownership and another resists, resistance starts to look less like tradition and more like suppression. And in today's climate, coordinated suppression doesn't just cause friction, it invites scrutiny. Legal, cultural, reputational. No league wants to be seen as the one holding talent back, while competitors offer partnership instead. Broadcast partners and licensing giants feel this pressure too. Their contracts are built on centralized control of player content, highlights, clips, exclusive rights. If athletes begin asserting ownership over their moments, the entire value chain has to be renegotiated. Suddenly, the most valuable content in sports isn't locked inside league vaults. It belongs to individuals who can distribute it directly, instantly, and globally. What makes this unstoppable is that it aligns with what's already happening outside of sports. Musicians left labels, creators left studios, writers bypassed publishers. Audiences followed. Sports was always going to be next. It just took one deal to make the shift visible. And once visible, it can't be ignored. This is no longer about whether leagues approve, it's about whether they adapt fast enough to stay relevant, because once players realize they can arrive fully funded, fully followed, and legally protected, going backwards stops being an option. The dominoes don't fall all at once, they tip league by league, contract by contract, and when that process finishes, the sports world won't look broken, it will look redistributed. There's no dramatic ending to this story, no single announcement that confirms everything people are speculating about. That's what makes it so unsettling. The shift didn't arrive with a press release, it showed up as a realization, a quiet one, the kind that rewires how everyone in power starts thinking. Because whether every detail of this deal holds exactly as rumored or not, the message is already out there. The balance has moved. The NFL is staring at a choice it hasn't seriously confronted before. It can double down on control, tightening language, reinforcing old structures, and hoping talent continues to accept the system as is. Or it can adapt, acknowledge that the era of silent compliance is over, and that some players are no longer arriving as raw prospects, but as fully formed operators. Those two paths don't lead to the same future. What Shedeur Sanders represents isn't rebellion, it's clarity. He didn't take anything from the league, he simply refused to give up what was already his. That distinction matters because it exposes a truth the system relied on not being tested. Ownership was never impossible, it was just rarely demanded. And now that someone asked the right way, the door can't be closed again. The next wave of athletes is watching closely. They're not just training their bodies anymore. They're studying contracts. They're learning how platforms work. They're building audiences before anyone tells them they're allowed to. Entry into professional sports is starting to look less like employment and more like a merger. And once that mindset takes hold, negotiation dynamics change permanently. Teams will adapt at different speeds. Some will resist until they're forced to change. Others will lean in early and benefit from talent that brings both performance and independent value. The winners won't be the ones clinging to tradition. They'll be the ones who understand that relevance can't be controlled the way it used to be.
This moment isn't about one quarterback, one team, or one contract. It's about the illusion of control cracking under modern reality. Leagues no longer own fame by default. They share space with players who can create, distribute, and monetize without permission. And once that's understood, the old hierarchy starts to fade. The question now isn't whether this model will spread, it's who will be ready when it does. Because when players stop asking for a slice and start owning the kitchen, the entire ecosystem has to decide whether it wants to keep up or get left behind.